It's very nice to be here today, and I'd like to thank Al-Kazaz and Syrian Canadian Foundation for supporting this event and for the continued partnership. As Cal mentioned, this is a partnership which is hosted by York Centre for Refugee Studies at York, but in collaboration with the Al-Kazaz Foundation, Syrian Canadian Foundation, and also Shore Consulting. I'd like to also acknowledge a couple of members of the team who are not here today. First is Lubna Bajali, who was a research fellow on the Reception Context Research team, and also Karen Anderson, who is also involved with the team. And the team, as it currently is, it consists of, well, it's 5 of us now. We were 4 before, but Nohair has joined the Reception Context Research team with this project, and that team will expand over time. It's not a fixed entity, so whenever we do new projects, people are welcome to join that team and to drive the initiative as they see it, and Nohair has been instrumental in that, and so has Arthur McLuhan. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of a background into this work and kind of introduce well, I'll hand it over to Arthur and Nohair, and then after that I'll come back to do a wrap up and we'll take some questions, I think. But really, this is the second project that we've been involved in that's looked specifically at the private sponsorship of Syrian refugees in Canada. But it's part of a wider sort of 5-country programme that we're involved in, where we're looking at the reception of refugees in general in Canada, the US, Jordan, Italy and Greece. So we've learnt a lot from looking at the Canadian context. And there's been around 200 people have participated in this research in the last year and a half, so it's quite significant, and that's just from Ontario. We've looked at rural and urban contexts. We've examined various variables around gender, class, religious affiliation, etc., etc. But I just want to say a little bit about the whole concept of refugee-host relations, because that's what we were kind of looking at, refugee-host relations. Now, in one sense, it sounds kind of obvious. We're looking at a group of refugees and a host, a population of like a host. But it's a very deceptive construct, right? Because there's no such thing as a refugee group, really, right? And there's no such thing as a host group, really. So when you look, for example, at the so-called Syrian refugee crisis, the Syrian population, as most of you know, consists of Sunni, Shia Muslim, Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Druze, Assyrians, Turkmen, Kurds. Yeah, it's a gendered and classed population. It's rural and urban. Now, how does that suddenly become a refugee group? A group of Syrian refugees when they arrive in Canada? It doesn't. It's not a refugee group as such. It's only a refugee group from the perspective of the host. It only becomes a refugee group from the perspective of the settlement context. And that's really the crux of the matter here when it comes. Our main findings revolve around that dynamic. The other element to that is that when you look at hosts, so in hosts, the Canadian population, you've got people who sponsor privately, people who don't. You've got various religious groups, various political affiliations. It's a gendered and classed population. Yeah? It's rural and urban. So to homogenise that as a host population can become problematic also, right? It's because you get differences in the way in which people respond to what gets called the refugee crisis, yeah? And again, that's the other aspect of this work, is it breaks that up, right? We break up the concept of a homogenous refugee group, and we break up the concept of a homogenous host society, not because we're politically inclined to do so, but because that's what we were told to do by the people we researched, particularly from the so-called Syrian refugee group, right? what we did was we conducted face-to-face interviews in Arabic with Syrian refugees. We did focus groups with private sponsor groups right across Ontario. We also interviewed public sector agency representatives. And what we found, which was really interesting, when looking at the relationship between sponsors and sponsored, a couple of things began to manifest that we weren't expecting. The one was that private sponsors who had engaged in pre-arrival communication with people prior to them leaving Lebanon, Safari, or wherever it was they were, had different results, let's call them results, than sponsors who hadn't done this. And it really came down to a couple of factors. The first being that when they engaged online, via telephone, via Skype, either through an Arabic mediator or not, what happened was that the whole construct of a refugee broke down. When you're speaking to somebody and you're talking to them on an interpersonal level, it's very difficult to maintain a self-construct around your group identity as such, whatever that might be. So when sponsors engaged with refugees who were planning to come, and they engaged with them in a very specific way in terms of the types of information that was being exchanged. It wasn't just things like, oh, when you come here, it's cold, the weather's really bad in Canada, right? This is where we're at in terms of your application for resettlement, right? That happened a lot, but that's not really the point. All of those things are to do with the resettlement context. They're from the resettlement perspective. Just to give you an idea of what I mean by that. So when people were going through the process prior to coming, and they would have to go for interviews with embassy staff or UNHCR people, you could see in how they were describing this, the interview, that they were being pulled out of themselves, right? Pulled away from their social and historical background into becoming a refugee gradually through the process of being interviewed. So for example, an embassy interviewer would say, first of all, they begin with security checks, right? Health checks. All of these things have nothing to do with the prior history of that person, who has a whole history that has nothing to do with being a refugee, right? But a medical check and security checks is from the perspective of the resettlement context. So going through those checks pulls that person away from who it is they are, yeah, and gradually turns them into a refugee. Yeah. So, and that's what was happening. So one embassy person working in the embassy said to the person we were interviewing, "Your destiny is in my hands, right? I get to decide if you come to Canada or not." And he said this in response to the person going through the process who had objected to the questions. The questions had initially been, has your daughter ever had a boyfriend? Has your daughter engaged in any activities, around having sexual activities? And he protested, this isn't done in our culture. And the interviewer said, well, it is in Canada, so you better get used to it, right? And the guy was gobsmacked, okay? He says, this is not what we do, it's not offensive. And the response was, your destiny is in my hands. In that interactive process, when they would say something like, when you come to this area, there's a number of possibilities for housing. Here's photographs of 4 or 5 possible places where you could live. Which one do you like? Now that's very different. And the person on the other end is like, oh, they're providing choices. and they wouldn't articulate it in this way, but this is how we analyse it. They respond. What's happening there is that the sponsors are saying to them, we recognise you as having a pre-conflict identity, an identity outside of the conflict, as a father, as a mother, as a parent. Yeah? Some sponsors went so far as to take photographs of furniture shops and say, we could get the furniture from this shop. This is the type of furniture they have. Or we could get the furniture from this shop. Which do you like? If you come to this area, you will have choices of 3 schools for your kids. There's the Catholic school, yeah. There's 2 public schools. If you go to this public school, there'll be there's less provision for English language training than this school. Which one would you prefer? Now that is not information exchange. Information exchange, resettlement information, is very different. And there can be many different sources of resettlement information. So the orientation sessions that refugees get invited to prior to arrival are put on at the embassies are information sessions where they'll be told about the weather, Canadian customs, etc., etc. That's from the resettlement perspective. That's information about resettlement from the resettlement perspective, the reception host society, not from the refugee perspective. So that information that they get isn't knowledge, it's not resettlement knowledge. Seeing Justin Trudeau on the news at the airport giving out Canada Goose jackets is a source of resettlement information, but it's not resettlement knowledge. So for example, one family of sponsored refugees said to us, we got to the Pearson airport and Justin Trudeau wasn't there. Why did they get it and we didn't? And sent an email to Justin Trudeau to complain. Now, I say that it's sort of half joking, but there's a serious element to that. What they got there was resettlement information from the media or from the embassy, but not resettlement knowledge. Resettlement knowledge is when that person is recognised as being something other than a refugee, and that resettlement is orientated based on that person's prior historical and social identity, yeah, as a father, as a mother, or whatever it may be, yeah. When they did that, it created a relationship where the uncertainty that's developed during displacement, not knowing what's going to happen next, which gets carried over to resettlement. Where are we going? Canada? I've never been. I don't know anyone there. What's going to happen when we get there? That uncertainty that's caused by conflict-induced displacement gets carried over to the resettlement context. When sponsors recognise pre-conflict roles, father, mother, what kind of bed would you like for your kid? A Spider-Man bed or a Batman bed? All the everyday decisions that we all make, yeah, that have nothing to do with being in a conflict, that have nothing to do with being a refugee. When those types of information are exchanged, resettlement uncertainty is reduced, and resettlement becomes more knowable to the person coming. They start to develop knowledge about that resettlement context, and the sponsors develop knowledge about the people who are coming. So it's a two-way relationship. So when that happened then, and they came here, they had a distinct advantage over people who hadn't had pre-arrival communication with their sponsors. Trust, let me just finish this sentence. Trust became, resettlement knowledge became an asset which grew over time. We call them resettlement knowledge assets. Yeah? It had its own value, its own intersubjective dynamic, which maintained, not perfectly, people still had problems, but that intersubjective relationship placed those people in a situation where resettlement the challenges of resettlement could be more readily responded to from the perspective of the people coming, not as refugees. as human beings with social and cultural histories, very different social cultural histories. And a couple of problems arise in the Canadian context, because the Canadian context self-consciously considers itself to be multicultural, a multicultural nation. And what that means is that people are considered to belong to different cultural groups, specific cultural groups that come into that. As citizens, they're multicultural citizens, right? A refugee is not a cultural group. A refugee is not a cultural group, right? It doesn't fit that. You can't respond to refugees as a group to be fitted into a multicultural context. Refugee group, people who are grouped into the refugee category when they come, are differentiate and self-differentiate, right, between themselves. So, for example, two people living in the same area, the response was, one said, "It's very nice. We like the Canadians, but we don't agree with their customs and their laws. We want to move to Mississauga, where we can be near Arabs, people with the same culture," right? Another person from exactly the same place in Syria said, "I really like it here, and the last thing I want to do is be in a population with other Arabs. I'm going to stay in this rural context where there aren't a lot of Syrians." And he wasn't being insulting. What he was saying was this, which is logical. We've just been through a conflict where Syrian killed Syrian, where Arab killed Arab, where Muslim attacked Muslim, where Muslim attacked Christian, Christian attacked Muslim. We don't know anymore who we can trust, right? So you can't just suddenly put us into a group of Syrians and say, "There you go. You're all part of the same culture." They're not. They come from the same population. A population has been devastated through conflict. That doesn't mean they will always be anti that or against being with Syrians, but at that point, they refuse to be settled according to the logic of multicultural citizenship. Yeah? So multicultural citizenship in Canada can in and of itself become a barrier to the successful resettlement of people who are categorized as being refugees.
Can I just ask my question?
Yeah.
Are you talking about private sponsored refugees who didn't necessarily have a strong co-ethnic tie to like their church here or didn't have family here? Because I see very different results if people have family that were the sponsors or part of the sponsor group versus ones that were kind of brought over more by their church or their mosque. I'm just wondering if you're saying your result is kind of independent of their co-ethnic ties to Toronto or Canada.
Well, we interviewed all of the above,
yeah,
who you've just described, and people who came specifically just with private sponsors who had no connection to them in the past as well.
Yeah.
So all three. The common denominator between all three is the desire to be thought of as being something other than a refugee. Yeah. There's an issue of trust where the diasporic connections pre-arrival can facilitate that. So someone, for example, saying, before we arrived, we were about to travel by sea to Europe, when I got a phone call. I got contacted by my cousin who knew somebody in America, who knew somebody in Canada who was looking to sponsor somebody. And it all came together, and we got in touch. We were connected with a sponsor group who we never met before. But the connection was made through trusted elements, right? And there was a sort of not a hierarchy, but stepping stones towards the building of trust, in which diaspora was included. Yeah. So that does exist. All I'm saying is that it can't be used as the model whereby we say, because I know that people who work some people who work in this area do consider private sponsorship to be an extension of family reunification. Right? Well, it's not. It's much more complex than that. It's not just family reunification by other means. The common element, I'm answering your question? Yeah. The common element is the desire to have a life beyond refuge. I had a life prior to refuge. I had a life prior to being displaced. I had a life prior to being in a camp or to being in some apartment in Beirut or in Lebanon. And I aspire to a life beyond refuge. I'm not going to be determined by that experience for the rest of my life, yeah? That's the key element. And it's facilitated in different ways, through different pathways, let's say, whether it be individual private sponsors who they've had no relationship with in the past, or family who they may have some kind of distant correspondence with, or I've had that in the past, yeah? Does that answer the question? So let's, should we move on? What's going to happen is I think Nohea is going to tell us a bit about the work and her findings doing interviews with private sponsored Syrian refugees, and then Arthur will talk about his experience of private sponsor groups.